So I'm actually going to pick this video up right on the heels of the last one. In this video, I am going to go over uh, one type of card in a deck, those being the Pokemon. Arguably the most important part of a deck. You can see we've got in this deck some Charcadets, some Ceruledges, Greninja, Fezandipiti, Regidrago, and Squawkabilly. The rest of the cards in the deck actually make up the bulk in general. Most of the time you're going to have largely a lot of trainers. This deck is peculiar because it also has a lot of energy, but we are not going to talk about that stuff right now. We are going to talk about Pokemon. So, in the Pokemon TCG, you have a few different varieties. We're going to start out by talking about this part up here, the thing that says basic. You have, in this game, basic Pokemon, stage 1 Pokemon, and in some cases, let's see if I have a deck that actually, oh, for sure I do actually. Let's look at Charizard EX. Stage 2. In general, it's just evolution lines. If you've played any Pokemon games, you would know, obviously, like Charmander evolves into Charmeleon, evolves into Charizard. How that plays out in an actual game is you are able to lay down a subsequent card on top of the basic one, right? So if I put down a Charcadet on turn 1, on turn 3, or on my next turn, I am able to put down a Ceruledge on top of that Charcadet to evolve it. Generally, the rule of the game is that you have to evolve one stage at a time. There is a card that we will talk about when I'm talking about trainer cards, which I actually don't have in this deck, but it is in the Charizard EX deck, called Rare Candy, which allows you to skip an evolution step. But we're not talking about that right now. And also, generally, you cannot evolve on the turn that you've played a card, and you cannot evolve on the first turn for either player. Those are the rules for evolution. And that more or less should explain basic and stage 1. An interesting note, and this gets into another mechanic that maybe we'll just talk about that now actually. So, in this game as well, you'll see you have like regular Pokemon. So this is just Charcadet, right? Charcadet can evolve into Charcadet, or Ceruledge rather, EX. You can see evolves from Charcadet. So EX Pokemon, in standard format right now, a lot of EXs are this thing. It says Terra there, but not all of them. We'll look at Fezandipiti. It is not a Terra. What EX means is this Pokemon is worth 2 prize cards. You can see it down in the bottom here. When your Pokemon EX is knocked out, your opponent takes 2 prize cards. So, in general, EX cards have something better about them that makes them worth more for your opponent to KO. So that's regular Pokemon. These ones are worth 1 prize. EX Pokemon, these ones are worth 2 prizes. You can see Fezandipiti and Ceruledge there. And Squawkabilly as well. Squawkabilly, its HP isn't that high, but it has a very strong ability, and so therefore it's worth more prizes, and the same for Fezandipiti to some extent, although its HP is 50 higher than Squawkabilly's, but then you can see Ceruledge is very high, and it's got high attack, but it's not really doing anything. It doesn't have an ability. It is a Terra Pokemon, but Terra... Honestly, this effect, we'll talk about it in a little bit here as well, but it's not super relevant. Moving on along the top here, you can see the HP. So this is how much health your Pokemon have. For people that play Hearthstone, this will not be that confusing, although the numbers are inflated. You could basically just ignore the 0 at the end of like any of these numbers if you want to see smaller numbers or whatever, right? And the same for this. Like, if you want to pretend like this is more like Hearthstone, just ignore the largest common denominator or whatever there, right? But yeah, this Charcadet has 70 HP. So if opponent's Pokemon attack into it and do more than 70 damage, or if it accrues 7 damage counters, which in Pokemon, a damage counter is 10 damage. So therefore it's like 1, unit or whatever, right? There's no 0.5s, there's no 5 damage, which is why I would say generally you can ignore this 0 because it's generally unimportant to the overall play of the game, right? So, this Charcadet has 70 HP, this Cerule Edge has 270, Radiant Greninja has 130. Oh, and sorry, actually, I started talking about the different types of Pokemon, but I only mentioned EX. Two more that I can mention from here. V and V Star are mechanics that are actually rotating out of standard when standard rotation happens, which we're going to talk about this little F down in the bottom later on when we kind of move down the cards. But I believe in March or April of this year, all V and V Star Pokemon will be rotating out, and same for Radiance. So let me just talk about V real quick. V Pokemon, Regidrago is not a good example, but V Pokemon are similar to EX Pokemon, but there was no evolution needed. I'm going to see, I think, yes. Lumineon V is a good example. You can see, even though it's an evolved Pokemon, even though, you know, Lumineon evolves from Finneon, it's a basic Pokemon. So V was weird with that. And then V Stars are just an evolution from the basic V Pokemon, right? So you can see Regidrago V Star evolves from Regidrago V. A little bit weird. It's essentially just a stage 1, and they all have some kind of V Star power. Until the standard rotation, I would say in general it's worthwhile for you to utilize some kind of V Star power in each of your decks, because it is a very strong effect. Like, for example, and I'm going to kind of skip ahead here and then we'll go back. Legacy Star on Regidrago allows you to discard 7 cards from the top of your deck and then put 2 of them from your discard pile into your hand. If you're a Yu-Gi-Oh player, you would know that sounds really strong. If you're a Hearthstone player, that doesn't make any sense to you, because what the heck is a graveyard or whatever, your discard pile? That doesn't exist in Hearthstone. But basically, this allows you to, especially if you are working on discarding stuff for the entire game, take 2 cards, any 2 cards that you need at that exact point in time. And this is an ability, and we're going to talk about abilities later on as well, but just know that it's not a move. Moves are a little bit more like, you know, stationary in what they can do and, you know, when you can use them. After talking about V-Stars and Vs, let's just talk quickly about Radiance. The Radiant Pokemon... Oh, sorry, just really quickly. V Pokemon are also worth 2 prize cards. V-Stars are not worth 3, they're also just worth 2. There was a mechanic previously called V-Max, which were 3 prize Pokemon, but they were extremely, extremely good. I think if I scroll down here somewhere, I would have like a Mew deck that... Well, anyways, we don't need to talk about that because it's not in standard rotation. I can talk about expanded at some later point in time if people are interested in that, but I'm not very knowledgeable on it, and the online client is very odd because it's not actually full expanded. Expanded technically I think goes all the way back to the black and white cards, whereas expanded on this client goes back to Sun and Moon, I think. I might be getting that incorrect, and if I am, feel free to let me know. But anyways, all that is to say that there's a standard rotation. It's vaguely 3 years worth of cards. I think it's 2 years and then whatever's being released in the 3rd year. Let's talk quickly about Radiant Pokemon. These Pokemon also are being rotated out with the next standard rotation. Very sad about that, honestly, because I think Radiants are like very interesting and generally very fun to play with. So you'll see Radiant Greninja here. All the Radiant Pokemon have Radiant before their name. And there's this Radiant Pokemon rule, which is you can't have more than 1 Radiant Pokemon in your deck. If I was to just search my card library for Radiant, you'll see every Radiant Pokemon is the shiny version of them. Just kind of a cool note, right? So you're only allowed to have 1 of these in your deck, meaning that generally they're inconsistent to use, but their effects are worthwhile enough that you would want to run one. So similar to V-Star abilities, you should be running 1 Radiant Pokemon in every one of your decks, unless there's just none that make any sense for the archetype you're going for. because their effects are very good. For example, Radiant Greninja here. Its Concealed Cards ability is you must discard an energy from your hand in order to use this. Once during your turn, you may draw 2 cards. Specifically for this deck, which I'll kind of go over, but generally this deck is trying to discard a lot of energy. So this actually serves 2 purposes for me, right? I'm discarding energy and I'm drawing more cards to get deeper into my deck. Incredible card. Radiant Greninja is one of the best cards in Standard, and it's run in a significant amount of decks. I don't believe Charizard runs it. This Charizard deck, yeah, this is running Radiant Charizard instead, which is a whole other thing. Radiant Charizard's effect is basically that it reduces its energy cost if your opponent has taken a lot of prize cards. So, uniquely, and its attack is very, very strong, especially if you're able to use it for 1 energy. Which is kind of actually what I try and do with this Cerule Edge deck, but once again, we'll talk about, kind of the unique stuff of that at a later point. So, we've talked about Radiant Pokemon, EX Pokemon, V Pokemon, Standard, regular Pokemon, and we've talked about all the stuff along the top here, right? You got the artwork after that, and then you will have a number of attacks, and we'll continue on down afterwards. So, beside each attack, you will have these little symbols here. This white one that looks kind of like a star means colorless. Colorless means anything. Any type of energy will do. So, we're skipping ahead a little bit to look at energy, but just for an example, if I had 1 fire energy attached to my Charcadet, that would allow it to use whatever this is, Light Punch, for 10 damage. If I had 1 fire energy, if I had any type of energy, it doesn't have to be fire, but if I had fire at work, I could also be using mist or jet energy. Or if I had water energies or grass energies or anything in my deck, that would still allow it to use this Light Punch attack. However, to use combustion, I would need to have a fire energy attached to it also. So it has to be fire and 1 of any color. And then I can use combustion for 20 attack, right? This one's got just 1 attack, it's flare, it does 30 damage. And this one has 1 attack, it's Will-O-Wisp, it requires fire, but that's all it requires, and it does 20 damage. You'll see Cerule Edge has a very unique attack. So most basic, whatever attacks will just have an energy, what it's called, and then the number that it does, right? A lot of Pokemon worth using will have the energy, the name of the attack, how much damage it does, with some kind of condition. So Cerule Edge, the reason that I'm trying to discard energy in this deck is that this attack does 20 more damage for each energy card in your discard pile. That allows this Cerule Edge to do a ton of damage. If I discard, I believe, 15 energy, which is significant because I think I'm running, 15, 17 energy total in the deck. But if I'm able to discard 15, I'm able to knock out a Charizard EX with 1 attack, which Charizard EX has 330 HP. It's a significant benchmark, and it's hard to hit, but that's kind of what you're aiming for with the Cerule Edge deck, right? Other notable stuff, Cruel Arrow, this attack does 100 damage to one of your opponent's Pokemon, any of them basically, so you're able to snipe with it, which we can talk about that a little bit later. There's like the active spot in the bench. Moonlight Shuriken is similar, you discard 2 energy and you do 90 damage to 2 of your opponent's Pokemon, so it allows it to snipe. But you can also see, of interesting note, actually we could also talk about this. Terra Pokemon have 2 unique things about them. One of them is that if they're on the bench, prevent all damage done to them by attacks, both yours and your opponent's. Fairly negligible, but it comes up, so you want to be aware of this Terra effect, because if there's an opponent's Pokemon on the bench and you're trying to snipe it with an effect like Moonlight Shuriken, you will not do any damage to it. So yeah, be aware of the Terra effect. There's been a number of times where I've forgotten it, and it's, messed with me. Second is, almost every Terra Pokemon has one of these attacks. which has, you know, fire. Oh, actually, not every Terra, sorry, but every. Because technically, I think Charizard EX is a Terra Pokemon. Yeah. So all these stellar Terra Pokemon, which, how do you tell? They have like a little crown around them. If you've played the Pokemon DLC for Scarlet and Violet, you know that stellar Terra vaguely means that they have every type, but that's not actually reflected on the type here, which I actually haven't talked about, and I need to talk about that as well. Instead, it's reflected in the fact that the stellar Terra Pokemon have attacks that require multiple different types of energy. I think it's usually 3, and they have, you know, either high damage or another unique effect or whatever, right? So that's stellar Terra Pokemon. Let's go back really quickly to this symbol up in the top, because it's very important, and it's very easy to forget about this as well. This symbol is the type that the Pokemon is, and it is the type of the attacks that it will do. So, this Pokemon's not a good example of that. I'm actually going to look at Charizard EX for this. Charizard EX is a dark type, but it requires fire energy. You might think when you use Burning Darkness that you're doing a fire attack, but because Charizard EX is a dark type, you are doing a dark attack. The reason that typing is significant is because of this part down here, the weakness, which I think we've talked enough about attacks generally that we can get to the weakness and resistance and all this stuff down here. So this is a little bit like, this would be very confusing for people that play, like, let's say Magic. It's confusing for, like, the only reason that this weakness and resistance is in the game is because it's Pokemon, and in Pokemon, the regular game, you have attacks that do more damage, super effective moves, stuff like that, right? I would almost be inclined to say that the weakness and resistance generally makes the game feel unfair, but I don't know if I would go that far. I know that when I'm playing into some decks with my Ceruledge and I'm able to deal double damage to their defending Pokemon because they're weak to fire, it's pretty sad for them. And the same for me if I'm playing into a water deck or a deck that runs a lot of water attackers. My Ceruledge is gonna just die way easier, right? Like, instead of having to hit 270, they only need to hit, 140. And they can take me out. That's really, really low, considering that this Ceruledge is worth 2 prize cards. So yeah, that's maybe a sticking point, and maybe something that people would really not like about the Pokemon TCG, but it's just worth noting that it is a mechanic. The different types, we'll actually maybe talk about them when we talk about energy, but generally, no, you know what, we'll look at it real quick. Where do I go to do this? Energy. Dark. Fighting. Grass. Lightning. Metal. Psychic. Fire. Water. Interestingly, not all of the actual Pokemon types in the games. Very weird. And then the rest of these are special energies, which have a whole slew of other, you know, information, but all of these count as colorless unless otherwise stated. Like Legacy Energy technically counts as every type of energy, but only one at a time, and so on, but Double Turbo's just too colorless, and blah blah blah. We're going to talk about that more later. I don't want to get into it, because it's not a long video, but that's another video. Okay, what else do we need to talk about? Oh, okay, let me look at this real quick. Resistance, I was actually told this at an event recently, and I guess it's true, I just never really thought about it. Metal types, and I believe either, is it dark or psychic? Let me just double check this. Do I have Gardevoir? Sure. Let me just check. Yeah, okay. So you'll see resistance. Only metal and psychic types have resistance. And it doesn't mean that they only have resistance, like they always have resistance to fighting or whatever, although I think that's probably often the case. And not every one of them has it. Yeah, like Ralts doesn't have a resistance, but you'll see Gardevoir EX. Now, With weakness, 90% of the time it's going to be ×2, I believe. Resistance is just a negative, like it's a flat rate -30. It's not like half damage or anything like that, because that would be really hard to deal with. But once again, this is another thing that if you're not paying enough attention, you will often miss, and it will lose you games. If you're playing into a Gardevoir deck and you're already, you're probably going to be at a disadvantage to begin with, because Gardevoir and the other Psychic types are going to be doing more damage to you because you're going to have weakness to Psychic. You're also doing 30 less damage with each one of your attacks into them, so, just keep that in mind. If you need to hit a benchmark, you need to hit a higher benchmark because of that. Last thing along the bottom here is the retreat cost. There are some Pokemon that will have none. I'm going to go back to Charizard EX again because it has the best examples of many things. Pidgeot EX has no retreat cost. That means you can retreat it for free. In the case where it does have a retreat cost, you have to discard the amount of energy that it states here. I'm 90% sure, at least in Standard, that all retreat costs are colorless. So you can put any energies onto this to retreat it, but generally it's not ideal to have to retreat something and discard 2 energy to do so, right? Because you're just taking resources away. In the case of this deck, it's kind of unique because theoretically I could actually retreat something for 2 and it gives me an advantage in some situations. Or alternatively, I can like swap things around and retreat for 1 and put more energy in my discard. But in general, it's, you want to use other means to discard stuff if you need to discard more than 1 to retreat it. But that's this. Last part of a Pokemon card is this little part down here. This, like, all this information, right? So, here's a good one. Okay. This one says G. Beside it, it says OBF. That means Obsidian Flames. That was the expansion that this card was released in. This one says H. It has SCR beside it. That means Scarlet Crown. SSP is Surging Sparks, and also Surging Sparks. Honestly, the SSP and the SCR and whatever, and these numbers down here, fairly unimportant, but that H or G is very important. Let's look at Radiant Greninja here. This one has an F. It also doesn't have the SCR or whatever because they started doing that in the G cards instead of F, right? But F cards are the ones that are going to be rotating in the next rotation in March or April, whenever it's happening this coming year. So basically, if you play, if you play Hearthstone standard rotation, you're used to it. The letters there are just a good, easy way to know exactly what's in standard rotation. If you're lazy, any card with a yellow border around it is rotating in the next expansion. However, that's not going to be easy to differentiate for long. And also all the Pokemon which generally have black borders are rotating in V-Stars, which whatever, So it's not, you can't just look for yellow borders, but you'll see these ones are also F there. And therefore anything that is D or E or anything before that, whatever, have already rotated out, so you can't use them. If I was to scroll back here and look at some decks that I played quite a long time ago, here's that Mew VMAX one that I was looking at, or looking for. You'll see these ones have E. This one is E as well. So these are all not available to use in standard format. I don't even know if there's any Ds in this one, actually, but anyways, yeah. And you'll see some of these cards are actually still in standard, like F, and some of these are still used fairly often in standard. Lost Vacuum, Iono, Forest Sealstone, but most of these are going to be rotating out very soon. Let's continue on, or actually, I suppose that's about it. So this last part that I explained down here is actually going to be relevant for all of the other cards, the trainers and the well, energy actually doesn't have it, so you don't need to worry about that. Well, sorry, special energy does, basic energy doesn't, or at least it's unimportant. So that's going to do it for this video. If there's anything that I didn't explain or that you need more clarity on, feel free to leave a comment. I'd appreciate it if you leave a like as well if you enjoyed the video. And yeah, look forward to the next one where I talk about trainer cards, these ones down here. Thanks for watching.